Hey everyone, I'm Susanna Alexander, and from August of 2022 to January of 2023, I was a student at the University of Tennessee's Clinical Mental Health Counselor Program. I came there as a recently divorced single parent of 4, and before that I had been a stay-at-home parent, and during that time I did a lot of volunteer work, mostly in peer support for not quite 30 years, but close. I also practice Buddhism, and I've lived for over a half a century, and I'm an able-bodied heterosexual white woman. But none of that should have been important. What I learned in the program was that not only were these things more important than my academic performance, they were things that I needed to fix or be ashamed of. And that's why I'm speaking up. After trying to work this out with the university directly, I feel like I've been left with no other choice. I also believe that the people of Tennessee have a right to know what their tax and tuition dollars are paying for. Not just how that applies at UT, but also how that relates to the field of counseling, which can affect everyone. I believe that the UT Counseling Masters is a program of ideological indoctrination that teaches bigotry and ultimately malpractice. While I was there, the faculty bullied me and tried to get me to disavow my Buddhist practice. They invited me to admit that I was a transphobic racist oppressor because I'm white and I'm old and I don't believe what they believe. When that didn't work, the university then acted illegally by blocking me from practicum, which forced me to drop out. They took this action despite my grades, which you can see here are 3 A's and a B+. If there are any lawyers out there, my contact information is in the description. I would love to hear from you. But anyway, to help you all understand what's really going on here, I'm going to share a few things. It's going to take me a few videos to do it. A lot happened, and I'm going to focus in chunks to keep the videos as short as I can while still getting across the situation. I'm also going to start with the big issue in counseling, and in later videos detail more of my experience at UT. In my opinion, there is a systemic problem in counseling countrywide, and here's why. In the master's program at UT, I was required to join the American Counseling Association, or ACA. The ACA is a national organization for all counselors. They have over 56,000 members. They are the world's largest association for professional counselors. They set direction for counseling and write an ethical code for counselors. They also created and promote the Multicultural and Social Justice Counseling Competencies, or MSJCCs. Now, CACREP, a totally different organization, they are the accreditation body for counseling master's and PhD programs. And in Tennessee, if you want to be a counselor, you have to have at least a master's. And they require curricular experience in social and cultural diversity. So for a university to be accredited, they have to teach about social and cultural diversity. And the ACA just so happens to have the MSJCCs prepared for this. Now, on the face of this sounds like a good thing. I mean, for me personally, learning about other cultures and history is awesome. It's like travel, and I love that. And it makes it so easy if you know a little bit about somebody else's culture to get a rapport really quickly. But let's take a closer look at how this program works. The MSJCCs are represented here as a graphic, and you can see people are divided up as privileged or marginalized. So right off the bat, you're reducing people into just 2 categories. Everyone. 2 categories. Where's the richness in culture here? The nuance? I now know this is a critical race and gender theories framework. And after having given it an honest go, I can say that I am not a fan. I found it divisive, very divisive. This is pigeonholing people into just two slots, like black and white or winners and losers. And is there any evidence that pigeonholing people, leads to better outcomes for everyone? I'd love to see it, because I think it just does the opposite. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me explain a little bit more about how this works. In class, we were shown this graphic and encouraged to use it as a way to evaluate ourselves, future clients, and our classmates. We were introduced to this as a sort of warm-up for our cultural competencies course coming up in the next semester. And we were told that the cultural competencies course is very challenging emotionally. So, in the lecture, which focused on intersectionality and identity, we were taught that white, heterosexual, gender-normative people are privileged oppressors. This is what they call white supremacy. So if your skin is white, you're a part of it. Marginalized people are black, brown, disabled, and LGBTQ. Transgender people are particularly marginalized and needed to be supported in their identity a lot. So if you are privileged, it is your responsibility to be aware that your presence is oppressive to marginalized people. You should take responsibility for their emotional needs by doing the work. In this context, that meant making sure that you didn't say anything offensive like a microaggression or have offensive body language. This is the same dynamic you see in abusive relationships. This is walking on eggshells. It's also oppressive for a privileged person to ask a marginalized person questions about their experience, because that puts the burden on the marginalized to educate you while they're already burdened by an unfair system and your presence. Self-monitoring our behavior, particularly our nonverbals, was stressed. The faculty was watching, and we were told that this was more important than our grades. It wasn't clear how we should educate ourselves on someone else's experience without asking them questions, other than by stereotyping. And I gotta say, I think all of this is incredibly racist and bigoted, and it's shaming people who are white, heterosexual, and gender normative. I think this is also profoundly insulting and infantilizing to the marginalized people that you say you're trying to help. This is the kind of thinking that people go to counseling to unpack. And I didn't come to the University of Tennessee to be indoctrinated into a social justice quasi-religion that wants to teach me to shame myself. I didn't. But I'll get to more on that later. I also want to show you how that comes up concretely in the ACA beyond the MSJCCs. This is Counseling Today. It is one of the ACA's publications, and we were encouraged to read and learn from these materials and from other things on their website. This is the September 2023 issue. So let's go over two articles. First, we'll go over the cover article, and you can read the cover here. This is about culturally responsive assessment. I wanted to be a counselor in part because of this issue. I have lost some people to this cause of death. And let me just say, any life lost this way is a tragedy for the person, their family, and their community. If you are struggling with these kind of thoughts, there are links in the description to find help. You are not alone. Anyway, getting back to the beginning of the article, we are directed to view the issue from a cultural lens, and by that, they mostly mean race. The article starts out with a few statistics. this data comes from the CDC, and the CDC breaks their data down by race. Hispanic is the only ethnicity that they record, so the article touches on marginalized men, blacks, Latinos, and Asians, with the Chinese culture being referenced briefly. And it begins, death by this issue among people in marginalized groups has been increasing at an alarming rate. I definitely agree. That's bad and it warrants attention. It goes on. American Indian and Alaskan Native people had the highest rate increase from 2018 to 2021 at 26%. Now, these populations aren't mentioned further, and I kind of find that surprising given that the rate increase was so high. But the article continues to make some good points about language barriers, hardships related to the COVID pandemic, and trauma. It also offers some good tips about building rapport, community support, and provides risk and prevention resources. But it also makes a lot of generalizations about culture based on race. While citing issues such as a sense of oppression, racism, discrimination, and hate crimes as underlying causes to this cause of death. These are strong allegations, and if true, that would be terrible. What they don't provide are references or data to back that up. And, to some degree, income level would be a much more helpful variable to explore in this situation. I mean, how do you even quantify a sense of oppression? I don't know. But I'm digressing. Now, I think there are some big problems with looking at these numbers through a racial lens and assuming that equates with culture. Doyon Alaskans are not Seminoles. Hmong people are not Japanese. And I am wildly uncomfortable making generalizations about groups like this under the banner of any race or ethnicity, much less individual clients. But let's go with the premise of the article for just a moment. Now, check out this line. Although the second highest rate was among non-Hispanic white people, this was the only group to show an overall decline by 4%. Okay, so this is the second highest rate of this overall, but it went down. So that sounds like a good thing, right? That is the last mention of this cause of death in white populations. What this article doesn't show you is the rest of the statistics that show the scope of the problem. So let's look at some of those now. In 2021, 48,183 Americans died this way. Of that, 86% were white people. And this is after a 4% decline. That's 41,146 lives. People with families, parents, children. To get a visual, the total lives lost to this in 2021 would be the same as 18 and a half World Trade Centers. And of those 18, 16 would be just white people. In 2021, white people made up 78% of America, but 86% of this sort of death. 33,573 were white men, or the most privileged oppressors. That's almost 13 World Trade Centers. I could say even more about men of all races here, but I will save that for now. If we limit the data to non-Hispanic whites, that's 36,781 people, or 76% of this kind of death in 2021 were non-Hispanic white people, or 14 World Trade Centers out of the 18. I looked through the archives of Counseling Today, and I could not find a single article that addressed this cultural angle. Now, let's look at the second article, Navigating White Privilege in the Counseling Room. Now, are these white Kurds, Germans, Turks, Russians, Welsh, Appalachian, Israelis, Armenians, Macanese? And how am I supposed to know? What about multiracial people that look white? Does it matter? Is it just the white skin that is the problem? The article doesn't clarify these points. Here's a quote. One red flag Godwin has noticed in supervisory sessions and in other experiences is an unfair weight being placed on therapists from marginalized groups to educate white colleagues about privilege. It's not a person of color's job to teach a white therapist about their community. Okay, another quote. As an educator, supervisor, and therapist, one of the things I see from someone struggling to manage their white privilege is an unwillingness to name their whiteness, not just in the room for the benefit of the client, but within themselves. When a clinician denies whiteness for whatever reason, they're denying what it means in the outside world and the type of impact it would have on a particular client. That sure sounds like race shame to me. Does shaming white counselors really make them better counselors? Do you have data to prove that? I don't believe that any career should require internalizing shame. Here's a great quote. Being able to take constructive criticism and see knowledge gaps is important to avoid perpetuating toxic whiteness. Let's just sit with that for a second. Toxic whiteness. It's even highlighted so you can't miss it. In the ACA's magazine, Counseling Today. Let's look at those statistics one more time. In 2021, 48,186 Americans died by suicide. 86% were white people. That's 41,426 lives. People with families, parents, children. 33,573 were white men or the most privileged oppressors. But the ACA is not talking about that. And the ACA is an organization of counselors. Their ethical code cites non-maleficence or avoiding causing harm as a fundamental principle of professional ethical behavior. And their overall mission is supposed to ensure ethical, culturally inclusive practices that protect those using counseling services. Inclusive of everyone? Thanks for listening today. If you'd like to help me in my fight and like my mug, look in the description. More tomorrow.